Next session, it's a special session we've never quite done here at the Leadership Circle Summit. We're honored to have Clifton Leaf back with us. So for those of you who have been to a number of summits, you've seen Clifton give keynotes, you've seen him moderate panels. He's been a fantastic friend to wear many different hats. Since the last summit, he was promoted to editor-in-chief at Fortune magazine and launched a daily e-newsletter that you should all sign up for called Brainstorm Health. He's a very dear friend. We're so grateful that he's taken time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. He'll be sitting down with MRF founder Kathy Giusti, who I know every single one in this room knows, to talk about her vision for all cancer patients. You heard Paul mention at the beginning, now she's been up at Harvard co-chairing the Kraft Family Precision Medicine Accelerator Program, in addition to all the work she's still doing on the MRF, to bring precision medicine to all cancer patients. I promise you, though, she's still #1 focused on multiple myeloma. She's inspiring us every day. She's still tenacious. Her purpose, her goal is very clear. And I really can't wait for all of you to hear about not only what the MMRF and what she's bringing to all cancers, but what she's bringing back to the MMRF as well.
So what Ann didn't say is one of the reasons why I wear so many hats is I have no hair, and I like to try to cover that. Thank you for this great opportunity to talk with you. I wanted to ask before we get started, does anyone have a wallet on them? A wallet? Okay, great. Can you just reach into it, open it up? Okay. All right. See, do you have any 20s in there? Can you see? No? Can you give me one? All right, the reason I bring that up is that sharing does not come naturally to us. It used to when we were kids, and even when kids, you know, we're just sort of used to not sharing. And in the academic medical community, it really doesn't come naturally. We have talked about this as a community. We've written about it. We've obsessed about it. And in fact, the New England Journal of Medicine just created a hub on data sharing. I don't know if you've seen this, but they kind of catalog all their stories on data sharing and the lack of collaboration, the lack of willingness to share data in clinical trials, to share biospecimens, to share data. And yet, of all the things that MMRF have done, you know, and we've looked at these 10 drugs and the life-saving and all that, you know, doubling, tripling longevity. The really impressive thing is the way you've changed the culture of sharing. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about why that was so important to you from the start?
What we realized at the MMRF was there were 2 ways to get data. One was the academic centers had really beautiful data, and they worked really hard on that data. And by the way, it's not the gentlemen in this room that don't want to share their data. They really do want to share their data. It's the system. It's the gold of an academic center. And then the second place to get data is from pharmaceutical trials. And it's hard for them to share that data. They don't want all that data going out to the public domain either. So we all met as part of an MMRC meeting, and we said, how would we ever go about sharing the data? And it really did eventually become clear that if we were going to share data, it was going to require the MMRF with the MMRC sites to actually fund our own data set. And if we were putting the $40 million into it, and we made the rules by which everybody would play, then that data would get out into the public domain. And it was probably the hardest thing we've ever done. I mean, it was over 5 or 6 years ago now. But I would say, again, going back to Keith's point, if we thought working with the attorneys on the clinical network was challenging, now you're working with all the attorneys at an academic center saying, we want you to enroll patients, we want you to sequence their genomes, and we want you to give us the data back, and we're going to put that data out in the public domain. We met, and I remember doing this individually with every academic center, and nobody really wanted to do this. So we ended up going to the community centers first, the Hackensack's, and said, would you be willing to put your patients into this study? They said yes. And then we went back to the academic centers and said, we're going to do it one way or another. Will you help us? And it was actually WashU that became the first academic center to sign on and to be willing to do the COMPASS study. And then, interestingly, every attorney from the other academic center called and asked, could they have the WashU language so that they could follow in that path? And so the reason I tell you that story is I think what the MMRF does well is that we bring everybody together. We try to decide, maybe not every academic center is going to say yes, but sometimes you find the right person at the right center that's willing to do the right thing, or the right person at the right company. And you need that first mover. Once you get a first mover, it's easier to get the second and third movers. And I think that's part of what we play. Like, even when Keith was talking about that for the clinical network, we did have to have a first mover that said, yes, we will join a clinical network. And yes, we will play by the rules of tissue banking and genomics. But then after that, whoever else came on board, it was a take it or leave it contract. You weren't going to change it for a number of 5, 6, 7, or 8.
And it was also take it or leave it when you'd have these conference calls and you're like, okay, if you miss one of these things, maybe we'll hear your excuse, but you can't miss two. I mean, you were pretty tough with the consortium.
Yeah, so going back to the
Let's celebrate your toughness. Come on, now's the time. You were so sweet in that video, but I know the real Kathy Giusti. I know the one with colorful language.
Well, so I think the issue of, and this is now we're going back to the clinical network, which was another challenging model, because I mean the hard part of this is creating these business models that help move the science forward. So the beauty of the clinical network is it was one of the first things we were doing. And the secret to that was, as I said, I could count the number of myeloma doctors when I was diagnosed on one hand. But fortunately, they were actually really great myeloma doctors. And we all really needed each other. I mean, we were the loser cancer in the bottom of the cancer center
when you were first diagnosed and you were looking for second opinions and you said, I'm going to see Bill Bensinger at the Hutch, what your doctor said, oh, can you take notes for me?
That's right.
Isn't that? It's like there was so little connection between these experts because they were so far flung and focused on essentially what was a research backwater.
Right.
I mean, there was no community of researchers. There were researchers and they were great and they were brilliant, but there was no community of researchers. That's changed.
And then, well, and I think, but the good news was when there's only 4 or 5 or 6 centers, you can, and you're starting to build your ecosystem, right, as a research-based foundation. I remember back then there were no research foundations. Foundations didn't look anything like the MMRF. They were mostly doing policy work or support groups or things like that. People weren't doing science. I moved into that direction because of a pharmaceutical background. But the joy was that the people that were out there, it was, Rafael Fonseca, and it was Keith, and it was Bill Dalton. And these were men that really did want to create a collaborative network. So because I could get my arms around it, we could all meet together, and it was a small community, and we all had the same interest in mind, which was to say, wait, we want to get novel drugs into the field of myeloma. We need new treatments coming in. How do we pull that together? So those 4 men worked side by side with me and with the attorneys to walk down the hall and say, we're doing this clinical network and you have to get behind the MMRF to do this.
So one of my favorite stories is you were gathering some people from academic medicine and industry together for the first time. And you got a book on how to moderate, and the clue they gave you was, ask this question: we would be successful in our effort if we did what? And so you tried that out, and then one of the academic researchers, one of the industry researchers says, well, I suppose it would be great if we could get some tissue to validate a drug. And then he said it offhand as if this was the biggest joke on the planet. And you said, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Well, I think we had a lot of conversations like that. That was one of the first meetings early on of the clinical network. And what we did was we brought together the 4 centers that were going to start with us on the clinical network. And then we brought together the pharmaceutical companies to say what would get you to drop your trial into our clinical network. Because remember, a nonprofit hadn't been doing clinical trials for a pharmaceutical company before. So why would they necessarily trust me or the team to get that done? But when we asked that question, what the researchers might have been looking for, which they already knew, they needed access to tissue, they wanted to know the basic biology of the disease, they wanted to know what the targets were, they wanted to drive all that work forward. And pharma just said, I want to get my drug in there as fast as I possibly can. Sure. And the truth was the answer as it often is, the answer was in the middle. So how do you build a clinical network? And that's where we came back to saying, we want a clinical network that will bank tissue, that will eventually sequence genomes, and that will conduct phase 1 and 2 trials.
And you told that to your board, and they were like, sure, no problem, right? Yeah.
No, not quite. I do remember that board meeting. And so it's a little bit like when we were launching Compass, because now, here's the other business part of this. Now you're going back to a board of directors, and you're saying, we want to do a clinical network. And I remember, you know, a few of the board members looking and saying, well, you're starting a biotech company. And I said, no, we're starting a clinical network. And they said, it looks exactly like a biotech company.
Right.
And then they were worried because now we're building out a new, new drugs, and what are the legal liabilities, and what does the board insurance look like, and there were all kinds of issues. The fortunate thing was one of our board members at the time was Joe Hogan, who was the head of GE Healthcare. And he just specifically knew exactly what we were trying to do. And you always need a few board members who go to bat for you in a situation like that. And that ended up working.
So you brought up the Compass study. And when you look at what the components are to the Compass study, I mean, it's a pretty incredible amount of work that you have to do. You're doing RNA sequencing, full exome sequencing, you're doing whole genome sequencing, you're doing whole chromosome analysis, you're doing, from top to bottom, it's a molecular analysis that goes from soup to nuts. And that's a lot. I mean, if you look at what the NCI does with its various, genomics programs, this is more comprehensive than that, it strikes me. So the question is, but you did something different. You started out and said, we're not just going to collect this, we're going to come in with very specific questions to ask. What were some of those questions that you feel like you've answered at least?
Well, let me step back just 1 second, because I think one of the things in between there was we had built our tissue bank, we had built our clinical network, and then the other piece of serendipity was I was sitting on the National Cancer Advisory Board where they were deciding if they were going to invest in sequencing the genomes of many of these cancers through a program called TCGA. Eric Lander was sitting on the NCAB with me. He worked at the Broad Institute, and he presented this whole concept. And of course, I knew the government was not going to say, let me do myeloma first. So I remember going through that meeting and sitting with him, and I called him afterward, and I said, Eric, what would it take for you at the Broad to actually work with us to sequence the myeloma genome? And he said, access to the myeloma experts in the clinical side, Y amount of tissue and this amount of money. And then I said, done deal. And we literally put together a whole program with the Broad Institute to sequence the myeloma genome. That was beautifully done, but the issue with that was that tissue was one-off tissue. You heard everybody talk this morning about longitudinal, and following patients over their entire journey is where you get the best information. You want to see what happens when we're diagnosed, but you want to see why we relapsed. So the truth of why we wanted to do the Compass study was it was a build-off of our initial genomic initiative that had started to already identify new targets for us. But Sagar and Keith and everybody else that was here that was in the room that time were saying, well, we need longitudinal, we need genomic, and we need clinical. You have to have that trifecta to make this worthwhile. And then over time, it became, how is this a hypothesis-generating study? And that's what Sagar was talking about, is everybody wanted something out of this. And the local clinicians, Hackensack or Virginia Cancer Specialists, they all wanted to know, how do I treat my patient? But then everybody else, wanted to know, well, what's a high-risk patient? How do you identify a new target, and how do we build forward? So we tried to make it as broad as we possibly could. So the truth is, the beauty of Compass, and it was really hard to do, is that it took all comers. You were newly diagnosed. As long as you needed treatment and you were going to go on an IMiD or a proteasome inhibitor, we were going to take you. And then we would do this vast amount of research. The hard part of doing Compass was going back to the board and saying, we're going to go spend $40 million now.
Yeah.
And they're looking at us like, for what? What are you really going to get out of this? And we're trying to say it's a hypothesis-generating study, and they're saying, well, it better be more than that. And so I think that's even the pressure of Compass today from our board of directors is now all this data is coming in, And even for the people in this room, it's not clear to the world that we are the only organization that forced our data to the public domain. Like when we were, and I'm glad that's why it started coming back, because when somebody was saying, well, what else do you want to know? I'm like, Compass is in the public domain. That's the whole point of it, because we want the whole world to use it. And that's why I think when you build Compass out and you want to get the maximization of that $40 million. The truth is, if Sager is going to use the Compass data to answer a question, I want to know that Sager's answering that question. I don't want that to be done without our having some knowledge that it's going on. And I do want Sager to give me the data set back, the compilation of that data, so that once again we can put it in our gateway and the whole world can see it. Because Compass alone only does so much. When you bring additional data sets in, whether federated or whether Sager's worked on it, that's what we're really trying to build. That, and I always want to actually ask that question, Sager, but the reason I asked it was because it's not always up to Sager. You know, sometimes it's the cancer center that constantly gets in their way. And so when I ask what's the incentive, my question is often, are you getting held up? Do you have a lack of money? Do you have a lack of resources? And is it always the case that if we say, we'll get you $500,000 and now you can go back to the cancer center and say, I'm going to get $500,000 if I play by the rules, is that what drives it? Sometimes, sadly, it has to be the money that does change the behavior, not just of the researchers, but of the system itself.
You know, so I want to ask two questions that are related. What is the question that you want to ask with the Compass data that you haven't yet been able to ask? And secondly, what are the questions that you can't ask with the Compass data?
So, Sager's heard me go through this many times. So when
you can come up to
when they put up that chart and it says transplant is better than not, a triplet is better than a doublet, I say, well, why doesn't the world know that? And the response I get back, and it's true, is that transplant is better than not, but not in everybody. So then what I want to answer is, then tell me who.
Right.
Tell me who, because the number, and we were just having this discussion, but the number one question, and Ann and I concierge so many patients, right? So the number one question we still get from every newly diagnosed patient is, should I do a transplant? Right. And Sager is saying, he would say, of course you should. Of course, all the data shows. It's not really true. It depends on what center a patient's going to. Some centers are much more transplant friendly than other centers. So, you know, I don't want to send you out there and you're going to go to one center, you're going to get all different answers. And so I want the data to tell you what you should do. Same thing of whether you should be on a triplet or a doublet. Or if you looked at those curves, you could see Kyprolis was actually doing pretty well in those curves. So does that mean we should start you on that? Like, when I start to see the hypothesis, I want the hypothesis to move to a fact that changes the clinical pathway by which we educate our patients. Because all of us knowing this and seeing those charts isn't changing the standardization, or as much standardization as we can get, of how we should treat the various patients we serve. So that's one major area of questions. And the second does tie back to, in this world of a very full myeloma pipeline, we, having come from pharma, you know you have to find a new regulatory strategy to get a new drug. So that means you have to find an unmet need in the field of myeloma to have FDA embrace that new drug. That often can mean that it's a highly targeted therapy, and we're going to do a phase 2 study with a highly targeted patient population. It could be high risk. There's many ways to do that, but we need to work together to make sure those regulatory strategies happen so we can keep getting new drugs.
And speaking of which, I mean, whenever we get together, we always talk about disruption. I know you love to disrupt, and you know, Paul, you can fill us in on all the disruption that's happening all the time in the Giusti family. But the area of regulatory disruption is an area I know that you're interested in terms of sort of redefining new pathways for clinical trials and regulatory approvals. So how aggressively will MMRF and you move into that area?
So I think what we'll do is we'll move into there's a number of areas that could be disruptive. So I don't want to move into it just in the myeloma space. I find that you have more clout when you create disruption across multiple cancers. So I'm going to switch back to my HBS hat for a little bit, if that's okay. Okay.
Please.
So up at Harvard Business School, Robert and Jonathan Kraft of the New England Patriots gave $20 million to Harvard Business School to focus on precision medicine because Robert lost his wife to ovarian cancer. They had sequenced her genome. They couldn't find a drug fast enough, so they gave $20 million. The reason they did that was because they felt that business models driving new incentives would actually change the world of cancer research, but they wanted the business school to help support that. So the joy of working at the business school is you have access to the faculty, the resources, the students, his Rolodex, the dean's Rolodex. So it's a pretty great place to be able to work. With my co-chair, who ran the healthcare sector up at Harvard, we ended up focusing and deciding to focus on 4 areas that we thought were critical in the field of precision medicine. The first one was this entire direct-to-patient space, which Keith was talking about. And the reason we care about that is we would tell you at the MMRF that we've been good at trying to engage all of our patients, but we are not nearly as good as we should be about getting every patient in the world engaged with us. So what we did at Harvard was we reached out to all the Harvard grads that were CEOs at Rent the Runway, Amazon, Uber, like all these, Marriott, all these really cool direct-to-consumer
which
companies.
CEO at Uber? Because they changed
No,
so
not
fast.
that.
Oh, okay.
Now we have a new person from Harvard going to Uber. So we brought all of these people in, and we had them meet with 5 to 7 different cancer organizations. And what they came in and taught us was how bad we are at direct-to-consumer advertising. And the reason they explained that to us was all they had to do was hear us speak, and they said, oh my God, if you talk about genomics and tissue one more time, our eyes are going to roll in the back of our heads, because we don't do that at Rent the Runway.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, because when I think of direct-to-consumer advertising and I think of drug companies, if I hear an ad that says "may cause anal leakage" again, I think my head's going to explode. So I mean, they are pretty good at it. So who's not good at it? So the advocacy groups.
The advocate, yeah. The clarity there. I actually, and one thing that would take us on a whole other circuit, because another thing we have been analyzing is how much are the academic centers spending in advertising right now, which that is somewhat mind-blowing as well. And I don't have a problem with that, but I do know there are much more efficient ways to get to patients than spending $50 million on an ad campaign that could go to research. But I'd be curious to hear how the researchers feel about that. But so going back to, I'll use Rent the Runway as an example, even though it's a female brand. They don't pay for advertising. At Rent the Runway, the way that they built that model was to say, we want you to wear a dress from Rent the Runway. And once we have your data and you tell us, what are you looking for a dress for? Is it for a wedding? Is it for a prom? Is it for a graduation? What may it be?
MMRF, full gala, save the date.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
So, and they focus with you on, it's not about the dress or your data, it's about the emotion of the brand. You feel good in that dress, somebody asks you why you're wearing it, and you say, I got this at Rent the Runway. You don't even say what brand it is, you say, it's a Rent the Runway. And the word of mouth continues to grow. You get value from the dress, the more information you give on your size, the brand you like, whatever it may be, the better the next dress is going to be. So we all do this on Amazon, we all do this when we're shopping. So I'm
wearing a bortezomib, or what do you say? I mean,
so no, that's exactly right. So now imagine that you're trying to get the myeloma patients to come in. We should be doing that off social media. I mean, everybody's on social media, right? And so for years we were petrified, like, oh, nobody's going to talk to us on Facebook. Well, the truth is, everybody will talk to you on Facebook. So if you start to bring that out and you start to use social media and you start to pay for Facebook ads and do all those things that we really have not been doing, you then filter the patients to come in and talk to you. Now, if you start to provide them with the information of why we need to know their subtype, that eventually we're going to then put you into my drug, or we're going to put you someplace, all you're doing is creating the Facebook pages that drive you to the right trial. So if I've always said that as a patient, what I would dream about is having those little signs that come up and say, hey, a trial just opened in a 414. You should know about this. Or hey, we've just updated the Compass data site and now there's 50 414 patients that you could be following and looking at. Or hey, this is a doctor that we realize is an absolute leader in the 414 space. Mm-hmm. So we watch all of these shopping and direct-to-retail consumer ideas, and at HBS, we then bring them back in, and then we're working across lung, pancreatic, prostate, breast. And the other piece, Clifton, that you'd be blown away by is you can't build a database if these organizations aren't using the best practices to design their database. So what we did find was a lot of them, I was a marketer, so from the day we started, we coded you by patient, scientist, clinician, nurse, whatever you were. Some of the groups didn't do that. Mm-hmm. So we're even happy to train everybody on business best practices, social media best practices, and then eventually we will develop a overall campaign for all cancer patients that would drive them to why bank your tissue, why sequence your genome, why, because at the end of the day, you need to get in the right trial. And we're building all that out across all cancers. That's one work stream that we're doing at HBS right now, and we meet every week, and we go over this, and we share best practices, and then we have specific goals. As these 5 cancers, we will triple the number of patients that are now entering into our registries and will then be educated on clinical trials. The second space is data and analytics, which is really similar to how do we find all the databases that are out there in the silos. We brought in PwC. We've mapped out every data set in the field of oncology for the whole world to have. We sent it out to Biden, Obama, everybody that needed it, and we continually update that and build it with artificial intelligence ideas and create that landscape. But the third is clinical trials, and that one we were asked to handle by FDA, where they approached me at one of the Biden meetings and said, listen, at FDA, we are so frustrated by the fact that I-SPY has been done, BATTLE has been done, LungMap has been done. These are master protocols that have really good and bad to them. There's just so many lessons learned. But then Beat AML starts up in leukemia. We start my drug up in myeloma. Agile starts up in brain tumors. Precision Promise starts up in pancreatic. Not one person has talked to each other. Mm-hmm. None of us have talked to each other. And so if you were actually saying to yourself, let me look at the ones that have already been done, let me look at Beat AML and the ones that are going on right now, and let's the 3 of us that haven't started up share best practices. And when I say that, I mean best practices of how did you design your study? If you're, and by the way, a lot of these are nonprofit disease foundations now holding the IND. This never happened before, where a group like us is holding the IND for a major multi-million-dollar study. Again, you're going back to what are the insurance issues? Our board said you're not starting this until you have a chief medical officer on board. We're not going to let you do it. So there's insurance issues. Now imagine you've got all these cancers sitting together, and now I'm looking at PanCan and saying, so what's your patient price for this study? We've never shared cost or pricing with a single cancer. Nobody. I mean, even when we did the direct-to-patient piece, the first thing you had to do for me to let you come up to Harvard is you had to tell me you'd be transparent. The first question I told you had to answer is, how many emails do you have in your database? And no patient group wants to make that number available because everybody gets pharma grants based off of how many patients do you have. And a lot of numbers are they're all out there. And so but we said, if you're going to play, we need to know your real number. And that's how I knew who we would play with. Same thing on the clinical trials. Come work with me if you will share the price of your study, how you did it, did you have a CMO, what'd your insurance look like?
So you danced upon one of the key reasons for this siloification, which is the funding. So people with a specific disease are focused on raising money for that specific disease, or so they think at first. And the organizations themselves, they have an inertia. They start to develop and get bigger, and they've got HR departments. I sat on the board of directors for a very large one, the Komen Foundation, for 3 years, and I was part of the HR committee and the governance committee, and was dealing with all those kinds of sort of corporate issues. So I understand how these charities, these advocacy groups, get to become where their model becomes a self-sustaining one. Mm-hmm. How do you break that? How do you change that model? And what has been the response when you've approached the folks at PanCan or others?
Well, one that I find is, I think the biggest struggle we have being an advocacy group, and I think the hardest part of running one is raising the money. So, so the challenge we're always in is that if you are, the scientists working with us, you do have to be beholden to your academic center. I mean, it is where you work, and we do understand that. We also understand, and this is the biggest quagmire, is that patients want their doctors to treat them really well, and they want their academic center to take really good care of them. I would, as a patient, I do too. So of course you want to give funding to your academic center. What we try to explain to everybody is it's not mutually exclusive. We're doing beautiful work, and by the work we do, usually the funding goes to the academic centers, but it's such a hard discussion to have. So sometimes you feel like you're almost competing with the same men that are helping you and that you're helping, and that really creates this crazy tension. It's also why these nonprofit groups never, I've been studying all of their revenue, they never really get above the 30 or 40 million a year. I mean, even if you're a big group like prostate or breast. And so there's only so much you can do with money like that, because money does change behavior. So ironically, the fourth investment stream of the HBS program is investment. It's how do you raise money and create new investment models that would benefit everybody. So an example would be, if it's going to cost, I'm making these numbers up, $20 million to get the MyDrug study done for us in the field of myeloma, would it be possible for a philanthropist to come in and support that study, but force the MMRF to share every bit of its information with pancreatic and brain and everybody else who's doing it? Is it possible to have somebody come in and help us with that model? And or is there an investment model that that study goes on in perpetuity? If you're constantly bringing in new biotech drugs, is there a way for us to really work with Paul and business development to get royalties downstream and to really start to build out new venture approaches, especially tied to some of these more intriguing models that these trials are really, really hard to do.
So to get royalties on drugs that you help develop and help accrue trials for and help provide the tissue for and the data analysis and all that.
Yep.
How does industry feel about that? About sharing licensing revenue and royalties?
It depends on where they are in their life cycle. So if it's a tiny biotech company and they need the funding, then they'll definitely play with you. I think what's going to happen over time could also happen in very precision-based approaches where we probably will be the group that can find the very specific patient type that you need for your drug. And that's why you go back to, why do you spread the net wide and do social media? It's because you need many, many patients so that when you get down to, I'm doing a deletion 17 or a 414 or a BRAF, it's really hard to find these patients. We were even saying for my drug, depending on how long that's going on, to keep finding those subtypes of patients, you need a team that's doing that. We have to do that. So if you were to position it that way, there may be ways to work with the pharma companies to get something downstream.
So you talked about disrupting the sort of philanthropic model for cancer. Is there what's next to sort of, where do you see the next sort of big change in the way we do things happening?
Well, I think what could end up happening is you may end up, we built a pre-competitive consortium when we did Compass, right? So we said, in order for us to fund $40 million and do Compass, we put half of the money in industry. The pharmaceutical companies came in and pitched in, and they could constantly look at that data, and that has been a home run for them. And the other half of the money came from philanthropy. I think what's going to happen is we will start to build new ecosystems of pre-competitive consortia. So an example that I would give you, and this is a small example, but if I had this question about transplant, you can imagine the payer has this question about transplant. So does the community, so does everybody else. So how do you bring in new ideas and new payers to come in and build these pre-competitive consortia, and what does it look like? And it doesn't mean that you wouldn't also start to talk to some of the big philanthropists that are out there that could try to really help change the whole
industry has
system
done this for a while. I mean, Semitech is a great example with the semiconductor industry of having a pre-competitive consortium where they work on common problems that affect metallurgy and all those sort of scientific problems that are sort of that they can share in. So, but this hasn't happened in the cancer world or drug development world so much.
Right, and I think that's why when you saw, it sounds so simple, right? Do an answer fund, right? And that just seems obvious, crowdsourced. But the truth was, we did say there were so many papers coming out of the Compass study, but we wanted to make sure that the questions we were answering were prioritized. Then you heard Colin Hill talk about, well, if you could actually go back and look at Compass data and see there are certain areas we want to understand in cell signaling or whatever it would be that would go across all cancers, maybe you do reach a point where it's an answer fund, but it's not just in myeloma. Now you bring it across all cancers. I think the joy for us is that there were many times that people would call and say, I'm really glad Kathy and this entire myeloma community has done such an extraordinary job, and we have done it together. I mean, you don't do these things by yourself. This is an entire team effort. But then people would say, but I wish they would teach somebody else how to do it. It's kind of mean that they keep this to themselves. And I always said to everybody, you can't transfer knowledge if you don't know who to transfer the knowledge to. Who's the low-hanging fruit of the best next organization to transfer this to? And I would say that's the #1 thing that has helped me working up at HBS and Kraft is we have done an entire landscape of every cancer group out there, because I can't work with everybody. When I did DTP, the direct-to-patient, I picked 5 that were in precision medicine, that were doing beautiful direct-to-consumer work that I felt like we could learn from. It's a different group when I went to the clinical trial space. It became, Agile, it became Beat AML. It was a whole different team. So now I work with those teams every week on that side. So I think the beauty is now I know who to call. Like I know before, and this is what I always will give credit to Kraft about, is I call his philanthropy highly innovative philanthropy because it changed behavior. And the reason I say that is I went 20 years only ever looking at myeloma thinking, because that's all I could do is raise the money, get the job done. Because he gave that endowment and he made it easier for me to get up there 2 days a week and be helpful, he changed the behavior of everybody, because now every week we're talking to each other and sharing every idea, whether it's in marketing, clinical trials, data, or investment models. That never happened before. So anybody in here, like Anne, she'll say, oh, I'm handling the marketing. She now has 5 other cancers, at least 25 people, because we bring in Twitter and Facebook, and everybody just shows up and they're now at Anne's door.
Yeah.
And it's so much better than it ever was before. And
Except for Anne, but yes, okay, yeah, right.
Yeah. So I think that's how you start to build it out. And I think innovative philanthropy, and we have many of them in this room, also are the people that when we have a new idea and we need to get that startup money out there, like the Answer Fund, nobody's funded that yet. We don't, I mean, Chris is standing there and showing it to you, but nobody's funded it.
The
My
guy
drug
with the
is not
wallet, I
funded
think,
yet.
is volunteered. That's right.
So that's what we love, is when people will take a chance on us and say, I believe in what was presented and I want to be the first person to sign up for that.
You talk about change of behavior. I'd love to talk just for a minute about change of mindset, because Paul, in his remarks this morning, talked about the sort of critical need to preempt these cancers, to prevent someone from getting myeloma in the first place, and by extension, any of these cancers. And this is something where we just don't do, because the incentives aren't there. People who have the disease obviously want to focus on cure and treatment, and even the knowledge that they are, even if it's complete self-sacrifice, and we saw Dick Parsons talking about, wanting to make sure that his information goes and helps somebody else, which is fantastic. It still focuses on the cure. How do you shift that mindset so that you're eliminating both sides of the burden, not just those who are dying of the disease and dealing with treatment, which is so arduous and onerous, but also with people getting the disease in the first place? So that's how you're going to reduce the burden of cancer, by focusing on that second part. So that's not an easy thing to do. And are you focused on that through HBS and MMRF, or is this?
I think what we actually, as a scientific team, we decided that because of the nature of myeloma, going from MGUS to smoldering and then into active disease, we actually together as a scientific community decided that was a huge priority for us. And part of that was also coming through because a few of us were sitting on the Obama Precision Medicine Initiative, and as you know, they were looking at healthy subjects. So in that situation, they are actually collecting MGUS people, and so they would say to us, well, do you care about those people? We would say, yeah, it would be really helpful for us to know it.
Amazingly, by the way, MGUS is the name of the next hurricane in the Atlantic. We passed now, where I think we're up to MGUS. Yeah.
But then for us, we then said, when we were doing the COMPASS study, there were people that would be smoldering patients, but because they weren't going to be starting treatment, they weren't into the COMPASS study. But we really did want to follow those people. I even looked at it myself. I mean, I smoldered for a long time. It's actually probably what saved me is that I had those years of smoldering while we did so much great work in the field of myeloma. So it's always been in the back of my mind is how do we prevent it? Right. And again, we did have a donor that came in, the Perlman family came in, and they worked with us to start what we call the Prevention Fund. And as a result of that, we have 6 centers working together in that space. But we also know the biggest challenge, and this is again where I think the myeloma community is really strong, you only have so many smoldering patients come to your center, right? So this is where unity and collaboration becomes really important. Just like in precision medicine, you only have a certain number of deletion 17 or 414. So if you're trying to create a critical mass of any subset of anything in myeloma, that's where the MMRC, we bring you together, we get it done, and we sequence those patients and we move it forward. But I think the joy of working with our team, and it is always great to have the best clinicians and the best scientists and the best people working with you, because at the end of the day, we also have to understand if we're going to look at prevention, it's not just about sequencing the genomes of these smoldering patients, it's knowing their immune systems too. So then we have to have a whole discussion like we did yesterday of what does that look like, who's going to pay to do all of that work.
So we've talked a lot about data, using the tools of the connected world, the social media you talked about. What are you thinking about differently now in social media and trying to, and crowdsourcing and other aspects of this sort of brave new world we live in?
So I would say on the social media side, we've always been hesitant to be bold and daring in that space. And now what we've decided, and this goes across all cancers, is...
That's what I think of, by the way, when we think of social media, I think, quiet, reserved.
Well, you think with cancer it should be. Because before you used to think, well, does everybody really want to get something that's showing them, hey, you're a 414, you want a trial? Or are you going to be the opposite way and say, I do not want to be reminded of my cancer every day? Right. So you can't predict. Not everybody's going to be the same in the social. I love getting those, hey, this was left in your basket, or da-da-da. Right. A lot of people hate that. I like it because you're busy and you want the reminder. So you have to be aware that cancer is a whole different breed. So that market research has to be done. But the joy of doing market research now is you're not doing like complete awareness trial and usage studies like I used to do at the Gillette company. Now you're just doing a Facebook ad and seeing if it worked, right? Yeah. So we had to, because we're not good at this at the foundations, we had to have Twitter, Facebook, IMS Health was doing social listening. We've had to have all of these teams come in and literally work with us on this every single month. And the person who runs this initiative at the Craft is actually Lori Marcus. She was here last night and this morning. And she's a direct-to-consumer expert. So she's from Pepsi, Children's Place, Peloton bikes, and she runs that entire initiative. The clinical one is run by Dixie Esseltine, who was the clinical lead at Takeda. So I have people working with me that know how to do this and spearhead it. So my view is that we, and Ann talked about this, we know that there is a certain journey that you go on in precision medicine, and it starts with getting to an academic center that actually can do the sequencing if you can. If you can't, there has to be another way to get you there. Banking that tissue, understanding your diagnostics all the way to PET scans or whatever it may look like, understanding that there could be a standard of care that you should be on. That's why we want the COMPASS data to come in, or it could be a trial, and then the importance of sharing your data. It turned out we had done that market research. We had validated that market research at the MMRF, but within 3 weeks, we got all 5 cancers to send that same survey out to their cancer patients to see if that same journey held. Within lung cancer, breast cancer, and prostate cancer, it did, and that's why all 5 cancers have agreed to now change their language, say this is what the journey should look like, and create a campaign that we can all use on social media together.
Last question. I want to just talk a little bit about the journey, because in that fantastic video, you talked about that conversation with your doctor, but before the conversation with the doctor, there was a note on the kitchen table. You want to talk about?
You remember everything.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that note, because I think it's important to just understand that as extraordinary as you are in leading this foundation and being the disruptor in chief in the cancer world now, that you started as someone coming home from a business trip when you're working for Searle. You come home and there's a note on the table in scrawl, from Paul Scrawl, that says, the doctor called, he wants to see both of us.
Right.
And you said, as the son of a doctor, what?
So basically I walked in from the business meeting, I saw this on the counter, I looked at Paul, I said, how long has this been sitting here? And he said, a couple of days. I said, does it not strike you as odd? And he said, no, what? And I said, as the daughter of a doctor, I knew, like, you don't tell somebody to come in and visit you with your spouse unless something's horribly wrong. So I knew right away something was horribly wrong. I just had no idea what it was. And so on my way to work the next morning is when I called him, and then got the news that he was an internist, but he was very suspicious that I had multiple myeloma, and that was the start of it. And it's so hard to explain to people, except for those of us that were there then. It was just such a different time, and because there was no hope, there were literally no treatments out there at all. So it was basically, your daughter's won, pack your bags, go back east where your family is, and live out the rest of the days of your life.
Well, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for, instead of curling up into a ball and shrinking away from this fight, that you joined it and made life better for everybody.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for everything you do. Thank you.